I always knew I was the daughter my parents tolerated, not the one they loved. But I never imagined they would burn my diploma in front of me, the degree I'd earned working 2 jobs for 4 years, while my younger sister got everything handed to her. That night started as a family dinner, candles flickering on the good china, my mother's smile a little too sweet. Then the document appeared, a family harmony agreement, demanding I sign away my entire inheritance to my sister. When I refused, my father's hand connected with my face so hard I tasted blood. And as I stood there, cheek burning, he ripped my framed diploma from the wall and threw it into the fireplace. "This is what you are without us," he spat. "Nothing." My mother watched. She didn't stop him. She smiled, but here's what none of them knew: my grandparents had been watching too, for 20 years, documenting everything. And they had prepared a twist that would shatter my parents' world completely. Have you ever discovered that the people who were supposed to love you had been working against you your entire life? My name is Jordan Francis. I'm 35 years old, a financial analyst at a respected Philadelphia firm, and I built every piece of my life with my own 2 hands. But understand why that matters. You need to understand what I survived to get here. I learned early that love in the Francis household was a limited resource, and none of it was allocated to me. I was the firstborn, but that title came with obligations rather than privileges. My role was to understand, to yield, to make myself small, so others could take up space. My younger sister Megan arrived 4 years after me into what felt like a completely different family. Where I received expectations, she received celebration. Where I earned tolerance, she earned adoration. I spent years trying to understand the difference. I never found an answer that didn't hurt. My 16th birthday taught me everything I needed to know about my place in this family. My parents had promised me a party. They let me invite friends, choose decorations, pick a cake. For one brief moment, I allowed myself to hope. Then the morning of my birthday, Megan developed a stomach ache. Within an hour, everything was canceled. I spent that day alone in my room, listening to my parents fuss over my sister's miraculous recovery downstairs. Then the doorbell rang. Grandpa Richard and Grandma Eleanor stood on the porch holding a small cake and a wrapped gift. They had driven 90 minutes from Lancaster County without being invited. Inside the box was a silver necklace that had belonged to my great-grandmother. "Real worth isn't given," my grandmother told me as she fastened it around my neck. "It's earned. This belongs to someone who earns her place." I treasured those words. But I also noticed that my grandparents' visits were rare, their calls infrequent. My mother always had explanations. They were busy. They had health issues. They preferred quiet. I believed her because I had no reason not to. College proved what I had always suspected. When I needed $15,000 annually to attend Penn State, my father didn't look up from the television. "You're smart," he said. "Figure it out." So I figured it out. 2 jobs, overnight shifts, weekend tutoring, 4 years of exhaustion that somehow coexisted with Dean's List grades. Meanwhile, Megan attended a private college with full tuition, paid a furnished apartment, and a new car for her 20th birthday. During a rare phone call with my grandmother, she mentioned something strange: money they had been sending through my parents for my education. $5,000 every year, $20,000 total, money I never saw. When I confronted my mother, she told me my grandmother was getting confused, that it was sad watching her decline. I wanted to believe she was lying, but accepting her explanation was easier than fighting. There were other strange gaps, too. Letters I had written to my grandparents as a child that never seemed to arrive. My grandmother said she received perhaps 10 over all those years. I had written dozens, maybe 100. My mother blamed the postal service. Every strange gap had an explanation from her. Every explanation was just plausible enough to accept. 15 years after college, I had built a life entirely my own. I visited my parents perhaps twice a year, and each visit reminded me why I stayed away. So when my mother called with unusual warmth, inviting me to a family dinner, my instincts flickered. She claimed my grandparents wanted everyone together. But if that were true, why hadn't they called me directly? I told myself it might be different this time. That people could change, that families could heal. I was wrong about all of it. I didn't know that dinner would be the last time I'd ever sit at my parents' table as their daughter. And I didn't know that my mother, the woman who always seemed so fragile and helpless, had spent 20 years preparing for exactly this moment. The dinner was on a Saturday evening. I drove to my parents' house with a knot in my stomach that I could not explain. Something about my mother's voice on the phone had felt wrong. Too warm, too eager. My mother had never been eager to see me. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed the lights were softer than usual. Through the window, I could see candles flickering on the dining room table. My parents never used candles. They never used the good china either, but there it was gleaming under the chandelier like we were expecting royalty. Fresh flowers sat in a crystal vase I had never seen before. Everything looked beautiful and completely wrong. My mother embraced me at the door with warmth that felt rehearsed. She held me a moment too long, said my name a little too sweetly. Megan appeared behind her, smiling, and actually complimented my dress. My sister had not complimented me since we were children. My father poured wine without being asked and handed me a glass like we were old friends. I took it and said nothing. I cataloged every detail because this much effort meant they wanted something from me. I scanned the room for my grandparents. Their chairs at the table remained empty. "Where are Grandma and Grandpa?" I asked. "I thought they wanted this dinner." My mother's smile did not waver. "They couldn't make it, some health concerns, but they send their love. They wanted us to have this conversation as a family first." That was the first lie. I noted it, but said nothing. If my grandparents had health concerns serious enough to miss a dinner, they supposedly requested someone would have called me. My grandmother had my number. She would have reached out directly. Dinner proceeded with aggressive normalcy. We discussed the weather. My father asked about my job with an interest he had never shown before in 35 years. My mother refilled my wine glass twice, without being asked, as if she wanted me relaxed or perhaps impaired. I barely touched the second glass. When dessert was cleared, the performance ended. My father reached into a leather briefcase beside his chair and placed a document on the table. "Jordan," he said, "we need to discuss the family's future." The papers were titled Family Harmony Agreement. Even the name was a manipulation. I picked up the document and read carefully. My years analyzing financial documents had taught me to find what was not being said. The content was simple. I would voluntarily give up any claims to my grandparents' estate. All property investments and business interests would pass to my parents and my sister. In exchange, I would receive the family's gratitude and continued relationship. I almost laughed. They were offering me nothing in exchange for everything. "Your grandparents think this is fair," my mother said, in that soft, reasonable voice she used when she wanted to sound helpless. "You're already so successful, Jordan. You've proven you don't need help. But Megan is still finding her path. And your father has managed Grandpa's company for 15 years. It only makes sense that it stays in his hands." I kept my voice neutral. "If Grandma and Grandpa want this, why aren't they here? Why didn't they ask me themselves?" My mother's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "They didn't want to pressure you. They thought it would be easier coming from family." "You are not my family's spokesperson," I said. "And this document has no legal standing. You can't waive inheritance rights to assets belonging to living people." Silence filled the room. My father's face reddened. My mother's mask flickered for just a moment before she recovered. "We consulted a lawyer," my father said tightly. "Then you should ask for a refund." I could have exploded right then. I could have accused them of fraud, of manipulation, of 20 years of theft and lies. Instead, I stayed calm. My mind was already working 3 steps ahead. These people had underestimated me my entire life. I was not going to give them the satisfaction of seeing me fall apart. "I'm not signing anything tonight," I said. "If Grandma and Grandpa truly want to discuss their estate plans with me, I'll hear it from them directly, not through intermediaries." I stood and picked up the document, holding it openly. "I'm keeping this for my records." "Put that down," my father snapped. "No, you presented it to me. It's mine now." I photographed each page with my phone, making no effort to hide what I was doing. Let them see. Let them know I was documenting everything. My mother's eyes filled with tears. "Jordan, why are you making this so difficult? We're trying to keep the family together. Why do you always have to be so combative?" "I'm not being combative, Mom. I'm being careful. There's a difference." Megan had been silent throughout dinner, scrolling her phone under the table, performing disinterest. Now she looked up and her face held something I had never seen before. Naked resentment. "Just sign it, Jordan. God, you always have to make everything about you. About me. You got the scholarships. You got to be the smart one. You got Grandma's attention every time she visited. You got to leave and build your perfect little life while I stayed here dealing with them." She gestured at our parents. "The least you can do is let me have something." I studied my sister, 31 years old, no stable career, no independent income, still living in an apartment our parents subsidized. Megan was not lazy. She had simply never been taught that effort was necessary. She had been crippled by kindness, disabled by indulgence, but there was something else in her voice. Desperation, fear. "What are you afraid of, Megan?" I asked quietly. "What happens to you if you don't get this money?" Her face crumpled. "I'm 31 and I have nothing. Nothing. Do you understand what that feels like?" "Yes," I said. "I do. I felt it at 18 when I realized no one was going to help me. The difference is, I did something about it." My father stood so fast his chair crashed backward. "That's enough. You will not come into this house and disrespect your family. You will not speak to your sister that way. And you will sign this document." "No." The slap came faster than I expected. His hand connected with my cheek and snapped my head sideways. The shock was almost worse than the pain. In 35 years, he had never hit me. "Robert." My mother's voice held warning, not horror, not stop, just careful. I touched my burning cheek. My father was breathing heavily, fists clenched, looking at me with something close to hatred. "You think you're so much better than us," he snarled. "You with your fancy job and your Penn State degree. You think you're like him, don't you? Like my father, looking down at everyone." And suddenly I understood something I had never grasped before. My father did not just resent me. He was threatened by me. I reminded him of his own father, the man who had always made him feel small. "I'm leaving," I said quietly. "You're not going anywhere until—" "I'm leaving, and you're not going to stop me." I walked toward the door. Behind me I heard him moving, heard something being ripped from the wall. I turned to see him holding my framed diploma, the one my mother had insisted on displaying after graduation, the one proof of my achievement they had ever acknowledged. He had never wanted it there. Now I understood why. He threw the frame into the lit fireplace. "This is what your independence is worth. This is what you are without this family. Nothing." I watched my diploma burn. The frame cracked. The paper curled and blackened. 4 years of overnight shifts. Thousands of hours of exhaustion and determination, reduced to ash. My mother sat perfectly still watching. And on her face, just for a moment, I saw satisfaction. Not horror, not shock, satisfaction. "Thank you," I said quietly, "both of you, for finally showing me exactly who you are." I walked out the door. No one followed. I did not drive to my apartment that night. I drove to Lancaster County, to the only people who had ever made me feel seen. I did not know yet that my grandparents had been waiting for this moment, that they had evidence I could not imagine, that my mother's careful 20-year conspiracy was about to unravel completely. The highway was empty at that hour. I drove with my hands steady on the wheel, while my mind replayed every moment of the evening. The document, the lies, Megan's desperation, my father's hand connecting with my face, my mother's satisfied smile. That smile. I could not stop seeing it. For 35 years, I had believed my mother was weak. A fragile woman dominated by a controlling husband, too passive to protect her eldest daughter. That smile told a different story entirely. I arrived at my grandparents' farmhouse just before 10. Lights were still on in the living room, glowing warm against the dark countryside. When I pulled into the driveway, the front door opened before I could even get out of the car. Grandpa Richard stood silhouetted in the doorway, 81 years old, slightly stooped now, but with the same sharp eyes that had built a construction company from nothing. "Jordan," he said, and his voice was unsurprised. "Come in. Your grandmother's been worried all evening." Grandma Eleanor was waiting in the living room with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. When she saw my face and the red mark still visible on my cheek, her expression hardened into something I had never seen before. Cold fury. "What happened?" I told them everything. The staged dinner with its candles and good china, the document titled Family Harmony Agreement, the demand that I sign away my inheritance, the claim that my grandparents wanted this, my father's slap, my diploma burning in the fireplace while my mother watched with satisfaction. When I mentioned that my parents claimed this was my grandparents' wish, both Richard and Eleanor went very still. "Jordan," Eleanor said carefully, "we didn't know about any dinner tonight. Your parents told us they were visiting friends in New Jersey. We specifically asked if you would be there, and your mother said you were too busy with work. The lie confirmed. My parents had orchestrated everything. They had used my grandparents' names to manipulate me while telling my grandparents I was unavailable. It was so calculated, so deliberate. We would never ask you to give up anything. Richard said, his voice tight with controlled anger. Never. You've earned everything you have. We've watched you earn it. Then why? And my voice cracked despite my efforts to stay composed. Why did it always feel like you didn't care? The visits that never happened. The calls that were always cut short. The money you sent that I never received. Eleanor's face went pale. What money you never received? The room went silent. I explained what I had discovered years ago. Eleanor's mention of sending $5,000 annually for my education, my confrontation with my mother, the gaslighting about Eleanor's supposed confusion and cognitive decline. Eleanor's hands began to tremble. Jordan, I sent that money. Every year for 4 years, bank transfers to your parents' account with explicit written instructions that it was for your education expenses. I worked 2 jobs through college, I said quietly. I never saw a dollar of it. Richard stood and walked to a cabinet in the corner of the room. He returned with a folder that was old and worn and filled with papers. We keep records of everything, he said. Bank transfer receipts, written confirmations, every payment documented. He spread the papers on the coffee table. $20,000, sent, received by my parents, never delivered to me. We thought we were helping you, Eleanor whispered. All those years. We thought we were making your life easier. You tried, I said. They intercepted it. Eleanor rose slowly, steadying herself on the arm of her chair. She walked to an antique chest near the window and retrieved a wooden box. The kind meant to hold precious things, keepsakes, treasures. I've kept this for over 20 years, she said, waiting for the right moment. I think that moment is now. She opened the box and began removing its contents. First was a leather-bound diary filled with dated entries spanning decades. Each entry documented something Eleanor had witnessed. Canceled birthday parties, dismissive comments. The way my mother's eyes would harden whenever I entered a room. I knew something was wrong when you were very young, Eleanor said. I confronted Diane when you were 12. She threatened to cut us off completely if I interfered again. For 2 years, we weren't allowed to see either grandchild. I learned that direct confrontation only hurt you more. So I started documenting instead. Next came letters, my childhood letters, a heartbreaking collection of perhaps a dozen, some yellowed with age. These are the ones that reached us, Eleanor explained. You wrote constantly, didn't you? We received almost nothing. I had written dozens of letters, maybe 100 over the years. Then Eleanor pulled out a larger stack. When we hired an investigator 2 years ago, we asked him to look into everything. He found these in your parents' storage unit. Your mother kept them, all of them. Every letter you wrote us that she never sent. I took the stack with shaking hands, my own childhood handwriting, letters about school, about friends, about wishing I could visit Grandma and Grandpa more often. There was a letter from when I was 9 years old asking if I had done something wrong because my parents said my grandparents were too busy to see me. I thought you didn't want me, I whispered. We always wanted you, Eleanor said, her voice breaking. We just couldn't reach you. Richard handed me one final document, a letter dated 2 years ago, supposedly written by me. I read the words, Dear Grandma and Grandpa, I want you to know that I don't need your financial help anymore. I'm doing well on my own. Please redirect any support you plan for me to Megan instead. She needs it more than I do. Love, Jordan. I stared at the page. Words I never wrote. This isn't my handwriting, I said. We know, Richard replied. That's why we hired the investigator. You always had a distinctive slant, a particular way of forming your letters. This was close. Clearly someone had studied your handwriting, but not quite right. The handwriting experts confirmed this letter was written by someone attempting to forge your style, Eleanor added. When we compared it to birthday cards Megan had sent us over the years, the analysis was conclusive. Megan wrote this, yes, and we believe she was instructed to do so. By who? My grandparents exchanged a look heavy with years of suspicion finally confirmed. 2 years ago, Richard said slowly, we mentioned to your parents that we were updating our estate plans. We wanted to ensure you were provided for appropriately. Your mother's reaction was extreme. She called every day for weeks, suggesting we reconsider, warning us that you were too independent and wouldn't appreciate it. Then this letter arrived. Your mother has been the architect of this, Eleanor said quietly. Your father goes along with her. He always has. But Diane has been planning this for a very long time. The revelations could have destroyed me. Instead, they clarified everything. 35 years of confusion. 35 years of wondering what I had done wrong, why my mother couldn't love me, why I always felt like a stranger in my own family. None of it was my fault. None of it was ever my fault. What do you want to do? I asked my grandparents. Richard explained their estate plan. 2 years ago, after discovering the forged letter, they had restructured everything through a revocable living trust. I was the primary beneficiary. 70% of all assets, including majority ownership of Francis Construction. My parents would receive 15% held in a restricted trust with conditions. Megan would receive 15% also conditional. But they had waited for proof, waited for the right moment. Tonight was the proof, I said. Yes, your mother finally overplayed her hand. I thought carefully about what I wanted. Not revenge. Revenge was my father's language, my mother's currency. I wanted justice, accountability, documentation that I was not crazy, that I had not imagined the injustice that my family had systematically wronged me. I want consequences they can't escape, I said finally. I want it done legally, cleanly, in a way they can't fight, and I want them to understand exactly why it's happening. Together we reviewed the trust documents. I suggested additions. A no contest clause that would void any inheritance if challenged. A requirement that all communication with me go through attorneys. Specific conditions for Megan that might force her to actually grow. I was not just receiving justice, I was helping design it. 1 week later, I sat in Mr. Harrison's law office, watching my parents walk through the door with confident smiles. My father wore his best suit. My mother had pearls at her throat. They had no idea that everything they had built on lies was about to collapse, and they had no idea that I finally knew who the real architect of my suffering was. The conference room at Harrison and Associates was designed for serious business. Mahogany table leather chairs, walls lined with legal volumes. Mr. Harrison, the Francis family attorney for over 20 years, sat at the head of the table with a thick folder. My grandparents sat composed and patient on one side. I sat beside them wearing my great-grandmother's silver necklace. When my parents walked through the door, my father was wearing his best suit and my mother had pearls at her throat. Megan trailed behind them, fidgeting with her phone. My father had arrived expecting validation. He had managed his parents' company for 15 years. He assumed this meeting would formalize his eventual inheritance. My mother smiled at me with practiced warmth. I'm glad we could resolve our little disagreement as a family. I said nothing. I had learned that silence could be devastating. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat. Richard and Eleanor Francis have asked me to facilitate the formal announcement of their living trust distribution. This is not a reading of a will. Your parents are very much alive and have chosen to execute an immediate restructuring of their assets. My father nodded approvingly. Very sensible. The distribution is as follows, Mr. Harrison continued. To Jordan Francis, 70% of all assets, including majority ownership of Francis Construction, the family residence at 847 Maple Drive, and all associated investment accounts. The silence was absolute. My father's smile froze. My mother went pale. Megan's phone clattered to the table. To Robert and Diane Francis, 15% of assets held in a restricted trust with behavioral conditions. Robert is removed from his position as operational manager, effective immediately. Robert and Diane will vacate 847 Maple Drive within 90 days as ownership transfers to Jordan. My father half rose from his seat. This is absurd. Dad, Mom, this has to be a mistake. Sit down, Robert, my grandfather said. We're not finished. To Megan Francis, 15% of assets held in trust with release conditions, including 2 consecutive years of employment and completion of a financial education program. Megan looked up stunned. I have to get a job. My mother recovered first. This is cruel. After everything Robert and I have done for this family, Jordan has manipulated you into this. Mrs. Francis, Mr. Harrison interrupted. Perhaps you should review the documentation before making accusations. He spread documents across the table. Bank transfer records showing $5,000 annually sent for my education traced to accounts controlled by my parents. The forged letter with handwriting analysis confirming it was not written by me. A comparative analysis showing the forgery matched Megan's handwriting. My grandmother's diary entries documenting decades of favoritism. My recovered childhood letters found in my parents' storage unit. These records demonstrate a pattern of financial misappropriation fraud and systematic interference with family relationships spanning over 2 decades. My father grabbed the bank transfer records. We used that money for household expenses. The money was specifically designated for Jordan's education, my grandfather said. Jordan worked 2 jobs through college, while you redirected our support to Megan. My mother switched tactics. The tears dried instantly. This is entrapment. You set us up. We didn't know about the dinner, my grandmother said. You told us you were visiting friends. You lied to us, Diane. Stop! My father's voice cracked. He was staring at the handwriting analysis. Diane, the letter, Megan wrote it. But you told me Jordan sent it. You told me she wanted to be cut out. The room went still. Did you make her write it? Did you tell our daughter to forge a letter from her own sister? Megan started crying. Mom said it would help the family. She said Jordan didn't care about the money anyway. I did what was necessary for this family. My mother snapped, all pretense dropping. Jordan was never really part of it. She was a mistake. I was 21 years old. I had a future. I was going to be a lawyer. And then she happened, and everything I wanted disappeared. The confession hung in the air. And then she had the nerve to be smart, to be successful, to make Megan look bad just by existing. Everything I did was to protect my real daughter from being overshadowed by an accident I never wanted. I felt something shift inside me. Not pain, just clarity. I had spent 35 years wondering what I had done wrong. Now I knew. My crime was being born. Thank you, Mom, I said quietly, for finally telling the truth. I stood. Mr. Harrison, I photographed the documents my parents attempted to force me to sign last week. I also documented my father's assault with photographs and a medical examination. I'm prepared to file a police report if anyone contests these arrangements. The trust includes a no-contest clause. If any party challenges this distribution, they forfeit their share entirely. I looked at my father. You burned my diploma thinking it would break me. But that diploma was just paper. The education is still in my head. You can't burn that. I looked at my mother. You spent 35 years trying to erase me because I reminded you of choices you regret. I'm sorry you never got to be a lawyer. But that wasn't my fault. I was a baby. My grandmother rose slowly. We've watched you try to erase Jordan for 35 years. We documented what we could. We never stopped loving our granddaughter. The meeting ended in silence. At the door, my mother turned back. You'll regret this, Jordan. No, Mom. For the first time in my life, I have nothing to regret. The legal process unfolded over the following months. I filed a police report documenting the assault and forgery. My mother pleaded no contest to fraud. 2 years probation, 200 hours of community service, full restitution of $20,000. My father pleaded guilty to simple assault. 18 months probation, mandatory anger management, and a no-contact order. Megan received deferred adjudication. None of them went to prison. I had not wanted that. What I wanted was documentation, official records proving I was not crazy, that my family had committed crimes against me. Now, I had that proof, signed, sealed, and filed permanently. I thought that was the end. Justice served, truth revealed, consequences delivered. But 3 weeks later, a handwritten letter arrived at my office sent through my workplace because its author did not have my home address. And it forced me to confront a question I was not ready to answer. The letter was from Megan, handwritten on plain paper, sent to my office because she did not have my home address. I sat at my desk and read it 3 times before I could process what my sister had written. Dear Jordan, I've tried to write this letter probably 20 times. Every version sounds like I'm making excuses, so I'm going to try something different. The truth. I knew what Mom was doing, not everything. I didn't know about the letters when we were kids or the full extent of the money, but I knew enough. I knew you were treated differently. I knew the money from grandparents was supposed to be yours. I knew, and I said nothing, because saying something would have meant admitting I didn't deserve what I was getting. When Mom asked me to write that letter to Grandma and Grandpa, I told myself it wasn't that bad. You were already successful. You didn't need their money. I was helping the family. I was lying to myself. I was choosing me over you the way I'd been taught to do my entire life. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't think I've earned that. I just wanted you to know that I see it now. I see what Mom did. I see what I did. Mom keeps calling me. She wants to strategize about how to fix things, how to get the trust changed. I stopped answering. I'm working now, at an insurance company. It's boring and hard and I hate getting up early. But it's mine. Nobody gave it to me. I don't know if we can ever be sisters. But for the first time in my life, I'm trying to figure out who I am when nobody's handing me anything. It's terrifying. I'm sorry. Megan. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my desk drawer, the same drawer where I kept my grandmother's diary entries and my recovered childhood letters. I did not respond. I was not ready. Maybe I never would be. But I did not throw it away either. 6 months passed. Spring arrived in Philadelphia with unusual warmth. I sat on my apartment balcony one evening, watching the city lights flicker to life below. It was the same apartment I had rented before the inheritance because I did not need a larger space to prove my worth. Some things I had learned were enough exactly as they were. I had kept my job. The inheritance had not changed my identity. It had simply removed a burden I had carried so long, I had forgotten it was there. I invested responsibly and consulted with my grandparents on company decisions. Every Sunday, I drove to Lancaster County for dinner. My grandfather taught me about the construction business. My grandmother shared family recipes and old photographs, the history I had been systematically excluded from for 35 years. For the first time, I understood what family was supposed to feel like. I had changed my phone number. My parents did not have the new one. The fallout from the revelation had been thorough and permanent. My father had lost more than money. Without his title as company manager, without the house that had symbolized his status, he seemed diminished, adrift. I heard through my grandparents that he spent most days in the small apartment they had rented, unable to accept what had happened. My mother had attempted to rally sympathy in their social circle, playing the victim of ungrateful children and cruel in-laws. But the evidence was public record now. The plea deal was a matter of court documentation. The friends who had once admired her perfect family slowly stopped returning calls. The carefully constructed image she had maintained for decades crumbled one conversation at a time. Megan had taken the job at the insurance company. Administrative work, entry level, the trust conditions required 2 years of continuous employment. For the first time in her life, she had to wake up early, answer to a supervisor, and prove her worth through performance rather than existence. I felt no satisfaction in their suffering, but I felt no guilt either. These were consequences, not revenge. They had been earned through decades of deliberate choices. The following Sunday, I arrived at my grandparents' farmhouse, wearing my great-grandmother's silver necklace. My grandmother noticed immediately and smiled. "It suits you," she said. It always did. After dinner, we sat in the living room, the same room where I had learned the truth 6 months earlier. Outside the window, the garden was beginning to bloom. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Anything, sweetheart." "How did you know, all those years ago when I was just a kid? How did you know I was worth believing in?" My grandfather considered the question carefully. "We didn't know you'd succeed," he said finally. "No one can know that about another person. But we saw how hard you tried when no one was watching, how you kept writing letters even when we rarely responded, how you worked through college without complaining, without giving up, without letting bitterness destroy you. That's character," my grandmother added. "It's not about being perfect or successful. It's about continuing to try when trying doesn't seem to matter. We saw that in you from the beginning, and we knew that kind of character deserves to be protected, even if we had to wait decades to protect it properly." I felt tears I did not try to hide. I spent so long thinking something was wrong with me, that I wasn't enough for them. "There was never anything wrong with you," my grandmother said firmly. "The flaw was in them, in their inability to see what was right in front of them. You just had the misfortune to be born to people who couldn't recognize your worth. That's their tragedy, Jordan, not yours." Later that evening, I drove home through countryside I had known my whole life. I passed the intersection near my old high school, the place where I had stood at 18 leaving for Penn State with nothing but a partial scholarship and determination. I pulled over and stood in the same spot. At 18, I had been terrified, alone, convinced that I was leaving because I was not wanted, not because I deserved something better. I had driven away that day believing that if I just worked hard enough, my family would finally see me. Now at 35, I understood the truth. I could never have worked hard enough. I could never have proved enough. because the problem was never my performance. The problem was that my mother had decided before I could walk or talk that I would never be loved. That was not my fault. It had never been my fault. My parents would never apologize, would never change, would never see me as anything but the inconvenience that derailed their lives. I had accepted this not as tragedy but as fact, like weather, like gravity, something that simply was. Megan might change, might not. I had decided to leave that door unlocked but unattended. If she chose to walk through it someday, I would listen. If she did not, I would survive. I had been surviving without a real family for 35 years. I had built my own, and that family was enough. I got back in my car. The sky was streaked with sunset colors. I thought about everything I had lost. A mother who should have loved me. A father who should have protected me. A sister who should have been my friend. I thought about everything I had gained. Grandparents who fought for me. A career I built myself. Truth finally spoken. Justice finally delivered. Peace finally earned. Some victories do not come with applause. They come with silence, the kind of silence that used to feel like rejection, but now felt like freedom. Not every wound heals completely, but some wounds teach you how to be stronger than the thing that hurt you. I was born to a family that could not love me. I built a family that could. That is not a tragedy. That is a triumph. And it took me 35 years to understand the difference. Jordan's story reminds us of something we often forget. The people who are supposed to love us unconditionally sometimes cannot. And that failure is never our fault. If you grew up feeling invisible in your own family, if you spent years wondering what you did wrong, if you worked twice as hard just to receive half the recognition, please hear this. The problem was never you. Some parents are not capable of loving all their children equally. Some families run on favoritism and manipulation, and no amount of achievement, no amount of sacrifice, no amount of trying will ever change a heart that has already decided not to love you. But here is the other truth Jordan's story teaches us. You get to choose your family, not the one you were born into, but the one you build. The people who see you, the people who show up, the people who believe in you when believing seems foolish, those are your real family. Blood means nothing if it comes with cruelty. Love means everything, even when it comes from unexpected places. If you are in a situation like Jordan's, document everything. Keep records. Save messages. Write down dates and details. You never know when the truth will need to be told. And evidence speaks louder than accusations. Protect yourself legally and emotionally. And most importantly, stop waiting for people to change who have shown you exactly who they are. For those of you who recognized your own mothers in Diane, your own fathers in Robert, your own siblings in Megan, I want you to know that your feelings are valid. The confusion you felt was intentional. The self-doubt was manufactured. And the day you stop seeking approval from people who will never give it is the day you finally start living for yourself. Thank you for listening to Jordan's story. If her journey resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another story. We share new stories every week about ordinary people facing extraordinary family challenges and finding the strength to overcome them. I would love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever experienced favoritism in your family? Did you find your own version of grandparents who believed in you? Share your story below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Until next time, remember that your worth was never determined by those who failed to see it.